Hi everybody, Anthony Proctor, one of the lab techs here at NoDa Brewing. You know, there's a saying that brewers make wort and yeast makes beer, and that's where the lab comes in. So probably our biggest responsibility here in the lab is making sure that we're putting enough yeast in the wort to make sure that it ferments out properly. Whether that's coming from the yeast propagator, which we'll talk about in a second, or another batch of beer, or possibly a starter or something like that, we want to make sure that there are enough yeast cells in there to do the job. So what we'll do is we'll take a sample of that yeast, bring it in here, put it underneath the microscope, take a look and count the cells, and make sure that they're happy, healthy, and that there's enough of them to ferment the beer out properly. So yeast does a number of things when it's introduced into wort. It creates CO2, it creates alcohol, yay. It also creates esters or flavors. Certain yeasts will impart flavors in the beer, but it also creates more yeast. It propagates. And that's what we do here in our yeast propagator. We'll use this to basically grow up a small amount of yeast into a large amount of yeast. So we can take a liter worth of yeast starter, throw it in this guy. About 3 days later, we have a 1.8, 1.9 barrel pitchable amount of yeast to put into one of our 60 barrel batches. So another thing that we do here in the lab is every day we come in and we check the gravity of the beer. You've probably heard of high gravity beers. What that refers to is the amount of sugar in the wort. High gravity beer having more sugar than a lower gravity beer. So every day the yeast, what it should be doing is converting the sugar in that beer into alcohol. So we come in every single day, check the gravity to make sure that's happening. Once that has happened, once that's done, we've hit terminal gravity, we're going to do a test called a VDK test. And VDK stands for vicinal diketone, which is basically a precursor to diacetyl, which is an off flavor in beer. It's like butterscotch or hot buttered popcorn. If you've ever had that flavor, it's no good. So we want to make sure that our beer is done and cleaned itself up and there's no diacetyl present in the beer. And speaking of off flavors, there are a lot more things to consider. And we're going to go to Chad Henderson to talk about that.
So right now we're doing a sensory panel. We do this twice a week and actually 1 to 2 Saturdays a month to basically give the staff an opportunity to train their palates on not only our beers and their standards to what we want them to serve like, but also a chance for them to learn certain specific off flavors and be able to identify them in beer in general and specifically in our beer if we have any question about it. Another thing that we like to do with it as well is if we want to change any sort of a process or add a different brand of a certain hop or a malt or whatever, and we want to use it as a testing ground to basically compare the same batches using prior ingredients to see if there was a noticeable difference, a favorable difference, or a negative difference, and basically make a call on whether we're going to continue using that ingredient or not, because as many of you know, most of the stuff that goes into our beer is an organic material and they change year to year, crop to crop, etc. This is a way for us to nail down if we really want to stick with the change or use a different variety because it's giving us more of what we want and keeps us closer to that brand standard or takes us even further with getting a more efficient batch. So it's really important for us to do it. It's hard to squeeze in on time during the week, but these guys are really dedicated to it and we've come a very long way in it.
Thanks, Chad. Another part of our quality control department is we check for dissolved oxygen in our cans of beer. So every single canning run that we go through, we'll pull cans off the line and test them for dissolved oxygen. A lot of dissolved oxygen in a beer over time will lead to some off flavors like oxidation, a beer that tastes like cardboard, that kind of thing. We don't want that, you don't want that, so we test every single canning run, we test for dissolved oxygen. So what we'll do is, like I said, we'll take a can off, shake it up, run it through one of these cool gadgets here that'll tell us exactly how much dissolved oxygen is in that beer. We average usually around 50, 60 parts per billion dissolved oxygen, which is really, really good for our industry. So thanks for joining us, everybody. I hope you learned a little bit about the science behind the beer, and we'll see you at the tap room. Cheers.
Such a good time.